We'll finish off our examination of the protists that are out there by looking at the algae. And remember, when we're looking in the kingdom Protista, you've got your zooplankton that are out there that are your animal-like single-celled eukaryotes, and you've also got your phytoplankton. And that's where we're looking at the algae that fit into two different supergroups. And you can see very different in terms of some of these related organisms that are out there. The algae, the golden and brown ones over here, are more related to things like the ciliates or the dinoflagellates. And then over here we can see our green algae and the red algae are more related to our land plants that are out there. But collectively, when we look at all of them, they do absorb nutrients over the entire cell surface. So unlike a plant where they're absorbing the components of the soil, the nutrients, through the roots, an algae can absorb it anywhere over their entire surface because they are floating around in an aquatic environment. All of them are going to use that green pigment chlorophyll A for photosynthesis in the chloroplast, and it's different pigments that are going to give these algae these different characteristic colors that are out there. And depending on how you store sugars and oils as a result of photosynthesis, that's another characteristic that can be used to classify the algae that are out there. So we'll start out over here with our chrome alveolata and then work our way down to this group here. And so if we look at the algae that are out there, and again, you can see we looked at some of these features with the alveolates, but when we take a look at the straminopiles that are out there, that's where we can see these diatoms. And again, that idea of phytoplankton that are out there. They're photosynthetic and they're storing their energy as various starches and oil, but these guys have flagella. And here you can see the little flagella coming off of this electron micrograph picture right there. Over here you can see some of the glass cell walls, what are known as frustules. And when these organisms die, these glass cell walls are going to sediment and they sink down to the bottom of the ocean or the body of water that they're in, and that produces what's known as diatomaceous earth, which is literally the glass cell walls, the skeletons that are left over from the plankton that was in that body of water that is out there. So that's our diatoms, and if we look at our golden algae that are out there, they're quite beautiful in terms of the structure there, and these guys go back and forth. The taxonomists have been fighting about this. They can fit into this phylum Chrysophyta or also the class Chrysophyceae. And when you look at this, it's basically a group of golden algae because of the pigments there. Again, they have chlorophyll A, that green pigment, but these guys have more of this golden pigment right there. And we're going to find them out in freshwater primarily. And if you look closely, you can see they've actually got two specialized flagella. So these are single cells that'll be swimming around in the algae that's out there. When you look at the brown algae that's out there, what's known as the phaeophyta, this is the most complex form of algae that we can find in the marine environment out there. They can be microscopic to looking at something like the kelp that we commonly see off the coast of California, and this guy can grow 1 meter in 1 day. So they are extremely fast growers that are out there. And unlike the other forms of algae, they actually do lack true starch. When you're looking at their storage of their food particles that are out there. Their food is basically converted into sugars and some other types of polysaccharides, and also they use alcohol molecules that are out there. So really kind of interesting. And when we look at kelp, it's the only real algae out there that has what appears to be some differences in terms of the tissues. And you can see a variety of different structures in this multicellular brown algae that's out there with the kelp. If you look at the red algae, beautiful photomicrograph right here, they're classified with this rhodophyta, which literally means rose plant when you look at that. And it's one of the largest phyla of algae out there, and they found more than 7,000 species that are recognized right there. A lot of them are seaweed, but we can also find them in freshwater. And you'll find them at deeper depths than the green algae, because they're basically using wavelengths of light that don't penetrate as far into the water, or that penetrate further into the water. And they're really kind of interesting. Some of them will actually secrete calcium carbonate, and so they are the ones that are building up the coral reefs that other organisms are going to live in. Also, when you look at the red algae, this is where we get agar. The cell wall layer outside of the cellulose has that agar polysaccharide that we use in the microlab to help solidify our media. The green algae out there, these come in both single-celled and also colonial forms where the cells sort of aggregate and they have flagella on them. Most of them will have two flagella there. And we can also find these multicellular kinds of seaweeds. There's about 8,000 species of green algae that we found out there. Most of them are going to be single cells, but like I said, we do find these macroscopic kinds of seaweeds that are out there. And when you look at the algae, they do have some interesting features that are built into them. Algae can bloom like crazy, and this is a process known as eutrophication. So think U is true, and troph, think activity. So it's a true activity. A bloom of the algae is where the algae just grows like crazy. And this is a picture that was actually taken in San Diego at night. And this is a bioluminescent algae. And so it lights up when there's motion around. And oftentimes with boats, when you're sailing a boat or motorboat and motoring around, when it disturbs the water, the algae in the water will actually glow and leave this trail behind you in the ocean. So quite beautiful to see an algae bloom at night there. The problem with it is, what if you ran into a lake where you had this harmful algae bloom with eutrophication with a red algae? And here, when you look at this, you can see it looks like this waterfall is bleeding right there. And what happens is the cysts form, those dormant resting cells are going to germinate and they reproduce, and blooms are going to happen in spring and summer when you've got plenty of light under the right conditions of temperature, and also if the nutrients are available. That's going to stir up the water and you're going to get this bloom of algae that are out there. And the problem isn't that the algae are kind of nasty, because if you go swimming in there, you're going to be covered in them. But the algae have mitochondria in addition to their chloroplasts. So the chloroplast is going to be producing their food, and the mitochondria is going to burn the food to provide energy for the cells to be able to use. At nighttime, the algae are going to be burning their food in the lack of sunlight. So they will turn out to use up the oxygen that is dissolved in the water. And that means aquatic animals like fish are going to die off. So now not only do you have this red nastiness in the water, but now you've got dead fish all along the shore. And this happened in Florida last year, where they had some harmful algae blooms and they had to shut down miles and miles of beaches that were out there. And to give you an idea about the size, this is a little boat that is sampling this red algae in this wave in the ocean. And this is a bloom of dinoflagellates that look like this little guy right here. And the dinoflagellates, if you remember, they release neurotoxins to stun their prey. Well, those neurotoxins are going to get concentrated by things like oysters and crabs that are filtering the ocean to remove these microscopic forms of life. That's how they eat. And so if you eat an oyster or a crab that has concentrated the neurotoxin, you can end up with what's called a paralytic shellfish poisoning. And you can go into respiratory arrest within 24 hours. And a lot of people, after eating shellfish, they think they've developed an allergic reaction. They think, based on their symptoms, when they're actually being poisoned by eating it. It's not an allergic reaction. You are eating toxins. And that's what's causing this problem, that people think, oh, I'm allergic to shellfish, when they're not. What they are is they actually have a problem eating poisoned shellfish that is out there. And just sort of as an aside, to show you one really weird form of life that's out there, a lichen is actually a symbiosis between two microscopic forms of life that's out there. If you look at this scanning electron micrograph, we can see a lichen that we've seen growing on rocks and trees and roofs and stuff out there. It's actually a photosynthetic member. It could be an algae or it could be a photosynthetic cyanobacteria, and that's going to provide food for the fungus that is there. If you're a cyanobacteria, you can also fix nitrogen. So not only are you giving organic foods like sugars and starches that have been produced by photosynthesis, but you can also fertilize the fungus there and give them nitrogen. And when you look, remember, symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms. And in this case, the fungus is going to provide a holdfast to hold this thing down. It's also going to provide some protection so the algae or cyanobacteria does not dry out. And they're going to help to dissolve minerals. So if you're have a lichen growing on a rock, the fungus component of it is actually going to be breaking that rock down. And in general, because of this, the algae or the cyanobacteria can survive on their own, but the fungus is really dependent on the algae for growing there. And this has led to this sort of debate. Is this a mutualistic relationship where they're both benefiting, or is the fungus actually a parasite when you look at this? And a lot of these lichens, when we look at their reproduction, they're going to break off and get dispersed, but the fungus is the part of it that actually goes through that fungus reproductive cycle, and then the spores that are produced as a result of it will have the algae or cyanobacteria stuck to it, and then the spores will float around because they break off, and then they'll get carried around by the wind to disperse them, and then when they get wet again, that will allow them to resume their growth cycle, because now the algae or cyanobacteria can start doing photosynthesis because it needs that water to start the process to provide the electrons for photosynthesis to occur. So really kind of interesting when we look at lichens that are out there, they have this symbiosis. And when we look at the fungus group that is out there, they do form parasitic relationships with organisms, but they also seem to form mutualistic relationships. They can grow into the roots of plants that are out there in what's known as a mycorrhizae. And that is basically extending the roots of the plant into, or the fungus goes into the root, and it makes the root-like structure even bigger because the fungus can transport water and nutrients into the roots of the plant, and the plant keeps feeding the fungus sugar. So that is a very mutualistic kind of relationship that we can find out there. So hopefully you've picked up some more information about these different microbes that are eukaryotic in nature. And again, focus on differences between the groups. What allows something to be classified in the fungus kingdom as opposed to this other kingdom? And then these differences between the different subkingdoms or subgroups that are out there. That's what I want people to learn from this chapter here.